The Story of the Clovis Culture, First Americans of the Stone Age. Episode 5. Disappearance and Mysteria for Thousands of Years. Before European colonization, over 30 million people thrived in North America for thousands of years. They hunted megafauna, built impressive earthworks, and developed complex societies, all before Europeans arrived and nearly wiped them out. Today we're going to look at the Clovis culture, one of the most widespread and longest-lasting pre-Columbian cultures in North America. At its peak around 12,800 years ago, this culture stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, encompassing many different groups of people. And while each group had its own language and customs, they all shared similar technology and lifestyle. And lasted so long, the Clovis points are like a common thread weaving together dozens of disparate cultures and time periods. In fact, for decades, archaeologists believed that everyone who lived within the Clovis culture was part of the same group of people. That was partly because they thought that this culture only lasted for a few hundred years during the late Pleistocene epoch, right before the end of the last ice age. For example, at Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, researchers found the bones of 42 mammoths butchered and discarded by Clovis people. Instead, they turned to smaller animals like deer and bison. But there's a problem with that because we also see that these smaller animals were less rewarding to hunt. Did the extinction of the megafauna cause the collapse of the Clovis culture, or did something else play a role? And where did all the people go? We've considered all kinds of theories from drought and famine to warfare and disease, but nothing seems to fit all the evidence. But while it's true that droughts may have contributed to the megafauna extinction, that doesn't necessarily mean that the Clovis culture collapsed because of it. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures, and we've survived everything from tsunamis to volcanoes to nuclear bombs. There's no reason to think that a little old drought would wipe us out. Imagine you're a hunter-gatherer living in a semi-arid environment. Climate change is already causing rising sea levels, melting glaciers, extreme weather, and a host of other changes. And while we can't turn back the clock, we can still go down a different path. If you want to harvest the meat of a white-tailed deer, you can only get about 20 pounds of meat per hour of work. On the other hand, if you hunt a bison, you can get 70 pounds of meat per hour of work. But if you hunt a woolly mammoth, you can get 350 pounds of meat per hour of work. Woolly mammoth meat was about 17 times richer in protein than beef and contained almost twice as much fat. To make things even better, mammoths were much easier to hunt than bison since their slow metabolisms meant that they needed to eat almost constantly. In other words, hunting mammoths was easy and rewarding, which is probably why every single Clovis group we know of went mammoth crazy. The kill site dates back 13,500 years and includes one of the deepest Clovis projectile point cuts ever found. That's pretty deep. Some groups moved to new environments, while others experimented with new foods, technologies, and social systems. Over time, they evolved into the cultures we associate with the Archaic period in North American prehistory. But others didn't adapt so easily. And eventually, they too disappeared, leaving behind a mystery that continues to intrigue archaeologists to this day. But what's even deeper is that above the kill site, there's another layer of sediment dating to 13,100 years ago with no signs of animal bones or human occupation. Basically, one day there's a giant kill site with mammoth bones and the next there isn't. But we have to remember that the megafauna extinction was a gradual process that happened over hundreds of years. It wasn't like one day there were mammoths everywhere and the next day there were none. Instead, the changing environment gradually pushed the megafauna to extinction. And the Clovis people had time to respond, time to develop new hunting strategies, new technologies, and new lifeways. Yes, mammoths disappeared, and yes, they were an important food source, but there's no reason to think that the Clovis culture couldn't have adapted to their loss. But more recent research suggests that the Clovis culture lasted much longer, appearing as early as 13,600 years ago, and continuing until around 12,000 years ago. This means that Clovis lasted through the end of the Ice Age and into the Holocene epoch when the climate started warming and the world began to look more like it does today. They were big game hunters who traveled in small groups and subsisted on the meat of mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths. After all, humans had survived one of the most dramatic shifts in history and were entering a warmer, more hospitable period. Yet somewhere between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, the Clovis culture and most other ancient American cultures completely vanished. So let us take a moment to talk about what we do know about their disappearance and why it's one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. But there's one thing archaeologists have never recovered: definitive proof of how these ancient Americans died out. See, when the world began to warm at the end of the Ice Age, the climate became drier and the environment shifted from tundra to grassland and desert. As temperatures rose, so did sea levels. Coastal groups watched as waves crept further inland, taking away land and forcing people to move further inland. Most importantly, though, the warming world brought an end to the Ice Age megafauna. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, and giant ground sloths went extinct. Disappearing from the fossil record around 12,900 years ago, it was an idea. Archaeologists call it a lithic culture, or more specifically a projectile point style. Lithic refers to stone tools, and projectile points are the kind of sharp handheld blades you would put in a spear or an arrow. Specifically, the Clovis people are named after the type of projectile points they made and left behind at archaeological sites. These points are distinctive because of their shape, size, material, and method of construction. They are usually between 2 and 3 inches long, with a leaf-shaped cross-section and a flute or groove that runs along one side. These grooves are key because they show us how the Clovis points were made, and use a hammerstone to chip away flakes from the edges until it was easier to work with. Then they could use a special tool called a punch, an anvil, to start chipping away at the point's shape. The punch was a hard piece of wood or bone, and the anvil was a flat rock placed under the core to cushion the blow of the hammerstone, and that's where the flute came in. By hammering the core with the punch held against the anvil, the Clovis people could slowly carve a flute into the side of the core. Once complete, they would remove the finished projectile point and continue working the core until they had made several points worth of material. But despite their similarities, the Clovis culture wasn't a single society. See, making these projectile points wasn't easy. First, Clovis groups would find a large piece of rock called a core. These techniques weren't unique to any particular tribe, but because they spread so far in theory, this should have been a great time to be alive. First, let's talk about what happened to them. And this isn't just some random coincidence. All across the Americas, we see evidence of this extinction event reflected in the archaeological record. In fact, archaeological evidence shows that after about 13,000 years ago, Clovis people stopped hunting mammoths altogether. But then suddenly, around 13,000 years ago, the mammoths disappeared. And without this valuable resource, the Clovis way of life quickly fell apart. So here are the questions that scientists are trying to answer. For example, consider the megafauna extinction. When mammoths disappeared, it must have been devastating for the Clovis groups who relied on them for food, clothing, and shelter. Another popular theory blames drought. After all, the end of the Ice Age was a dry period in North America. Instead, we should focus on something that has the potential to affect everyone, plants, animals, and the environment. Thanks for watching.